Hi guys, my name is Savannah Sanders. I'm the founder of sextraffickingprevention.org and the author of Sex Trafficking Prevention, a trauma-informed approach for parents and professionals. I am also the former director of Community Outreach and Human Trafficking Services, is one of the largest domestic violence shelters in the country. So I've been doing anti-trafficking work for about 10 years. I've done program development, I've done trainings, keynotes, worked with a lot of community partners to be able to build trauma-informed, survivor-informed programming across the United States. And also trauma-informed care is kind of my shtick. It's my favorite thing to talk about and train on. And I've been doing that for a really long time. Recently, I was in a position where it was my job to come into a domestic violence shelter and fully be able to integrate services into the shelter for human trafficking survivors to be able to make sure that they were getting their needs met, work on identification, and look at how we can integrate those services without causing segregation. So that's been a big passion of mine for a really long time, trying to help integrate those services in different programs, because we see a lot of times that those services sometimes get separated, and I want to show that we can work with vulnerable populations under the same roof to be able to get their needs met across the board. And this is Sandy.
Great. So I am Sandy Scalane. I am currently a consultant. I'm also I also teach a class called Sex Trafficking Building Solutions at Florida International University. And prior to this, I'm the founder of a project house in Miami, Florida. And that was Christie House is a child advocacy center that works with sexually abused children. And I founded the program within the Child Advocacy Center that works specifically with commercially sexually exploited and sexually trafficked children. This issue is a really issue for me, primarily because the work that I have done in the past has been to integrate human trafficking work into already existing services and programs with vulnerable populations, and have found that to be very successful in the past. I've been doing this work since 2002. I've worked in Thailand, in New York City. I have trained over 15,000 people on this topic. I've been inside prison. I've spoke stages to all kinds of VIPs and everybody in between. And it's really a passion of mine to be able to empower world who are going to be doing direct services with survivors of trafficking and really help them to feel like they have the proper skill set, confidence to be able to engage survivors and really be effective in the work that you're doing and see successful long-term outcomes. So really excited to be here today. Thank you.
Human trafficking intersects with all sorts of different services that are already existing. And for a long time, there's been a focus on separation, and sometimes separation is good, but when we are talking about the lack of beds and the lack of services, we have all of these agencies that already exist that have the opportunity and have already been serving this population. So we're going to be talking about domestic violence and sexual assault shelters, substance abuse agencies, runaway and homeless youth shelters, child advocacy centers, child welfare agencies, community health and mental health centers, and the juvenile justice system. Those are all different areas, some of the areas that human trafficking exists and are already probably receiving services in those areas.
Yeah, so the big thing that I think we need to consider, we hear about when we're doing training, people that are working in these agencies, often possibly identifying victims and survivors, not sure what to do about it. They don't have the proper protocols in place, and really getting through that initial hump of how do you get from the point of knowing that you're possibly seeing these clients in your agencies to do about it? What are the fears? What are the challenges that we see in this work in getting things going?
I think for me too, one of the things, like when we were looking at integration of services for us at the shelter, one of the things that kept coming up for us was that everybody needed to be trained on red flags, red flags, red flags. And red flags are really important things to be trained on. But for us, like, it wasn't just about identifying red flags, because exploitation happens in so many different ways and people's stories are different. And so when we were looking at trying to identify, it actually was about screening everybody, and because we were already serving this population, and people were really blown away by the fact, like, one year we had one trafficking survivor that we served, and then the next year we had 37, but that number wasn't because we had an increase in referrals. It was just because we were doing a better job at identifying at that time, and those were already people we were serving within the shelter.
Yeah, and similarly in the Child Advocacy Center, we're working with sexually abused children. So when I started working with Project Gold and we got these referrals in, I was noticing that a lot of these referrals were of cases that had formerly been cases at the agency that had been sexual abuse cases earlier, when the children were young, back to me as teenagers. And when I looked back through the cases, I would see things such as that they were on the run, they ran away several times, and so then we had to close the case because they were no-shows, too many times. So what you notice is, when you start providing, you start being mindful of what the needs are of this population, and you create space and protocol for a little more flexibility, or however you start working, actually be able to see that there are cases that are already in your agency that are kind of slipping through the cracks, or that you're not really identifying. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important to be able to even integrate just even a basic knowledge and a general trauma-informed care that's going to be able to open up the people that you're working with.
Absolutely. And I think we've talked about this several times too, Sandy, is some of the fears that come up with integration of services for trafficking survivors. Like almost every time I'm talking to somebody, some of these fears are the things that hold them back from taking on this issue, like safety and recruitment. And so how did you address some of that in the program that you were running?
Yeah, safety is it's a huge fear. I think a lot of agencies focus on liability issues and really manage their risk that makes protocols very inflexible. Like the program itself is kind of inflexible and creates barriers to working with this population. So the safety itself, the way that we dealt with it, we made sure that we had very specific protocols for safety, including when advocates were going out to meet people for the first time in the field, that they might bring workers with them or meet somebody in a neutral location. I mean, we were very specific about how to manage the safety issues, and they were all written down, but they were also flexible. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that you were only allowed to see your client in the office between 9. That was not going to meet the needs of our clients. So we had to make sure that we were always in touch with each other. And way to manage safety. Some people use metal detectors. We had an office briefly in a domestic violence intake center. And to get into the office, which co-locates a bunch of different programs, they had to go through a metal detector or searching through their purse. And that was supposed to be for the safety of all the clients that were victims of domestic violence, which will, however, for this population that I was working with, teenage girls who were mostly sexually trafficked and exploited, that was not a safe because they felt like their privacy was being invaded. They felt like they didn't have control in that situation, and you know, they're dealing with PTSD, and it could be a very triggering thing for them. So, so everybody has to come up with what really constitutes some of the important things that I think to think about, especially when you are working with issues of sex trafficking. But anytime that the perpetrator, the trafficker, might attach still to the client, because sometimes they'll still be attached to the client, and there's when they're going to older teenagers who are still at that kind of exiting the, you know, trafficking situation. You don't necessarily want to have them waiting in a waiting room with you know, 8-year-old kids who have a history of sexual abuse or abuse, or who are vulnerable emotionally, psychologically, things like that. You have to think about all of these things. There has to be conversations, meetings. What do you do when somebody is coming to your door that isn't a safe person? How do you manage that? How do you manage when the trafficker comes to the door of your building? And these are all fears, obviously. But is this something that is commonly happens? No. Okay. I think that there's a big fear. There's a big fear for workers' safety, whether if you're working with trafficking victims, you're going to end up being the target of a trafficker. And all the times that I've been doing this, one instance where a caseworker was trying to relocate because they were afraid of a trafficker. But for the traffickers, don't want to mess with social workers, right? They don't want to mess with people that are in the system, because we have people that care about us. We have law enforcement that cares about us. It would make the news, right? But people that are being trafficked tend to be vulnerable people who are not necessarily new. So they're like a dime a dozen, unfortunately. I hate to say that, but the traffickers that were pimping out the girls I worked with, the girls to my services, and they would just go to the middle school and pick up another one. So they didn't really, the cost benefit of them, harassing is not very high, but you have to have the safety plan in place, right? You can't be stupid about it, obviously. So that's just something I think, in this field, it's important to we have to be risk tolerant, and these are risk tolerant. So you have to define what that means for you, as opposed to risk averse, to be really and truly effective.
Yeah.
I think you have to tough uncertainty.
I think it's important for people to recognize like their scope of work is a big part of this before taking on this issue. I mean, again, you're already probably working with this population in some capacity, but really knowing what your capacity is. So like in a domestic violence shelter that serves both men and women, and families, that you have a lot of opportunity to work with various types of trafficking within that platform, right? So if you work with men and women and children who have been labor and sex trafficked, it really integrates fully. But if you have a runaway and youth shelter, you have to decide, you're not going to be able to serve adult men in a runaway and homeless youth shelter, right? So really looking and identifying in the scope of service first, and a lot of times I feel like a lot of the emphasis gets put on trafficking, sex trafficking sometimes, and labor trafficking gets, kind of cut out of the system when we're looking at shelter services and different types of integration of services. It definitely tends to get left out of the conversation sometimes. So before even getting started, I think having meetings with leadership and being able to understand how you're going, which population you're fully going to be able to serve within the constraints of the agency that you're working in.
Yeah, I think that's really important to, the fears that we have, I think, can be alleviated pretty easily as long as you feel like you're fully prepared and in control of the situation, that you have your guidelines and, written down, that the scope of work that you're going to perform, you're not going to scope. And that's all really important. I mean, there are valid issues, right? So, aside from safety, recruitment of other clients, crisis management, because there's often crises in the middle of the night. How are you going to manage that? Is that something that can be done by the agent? Gives the workers in the agency anxiety because it's not what they do, right? The fear of actually being effective with this population, really being able to do the work and see the long-term outcomes of the work that you're doing, right? And knowing network is also sometimes a challenge. You might be already plugged into the homeless services, or you might be plugged violence services, but you might not know about the trafficking task forces and things like that. And knowing how to get in those networks and how to get that kind of credibility and recognition as a service provider. You might have fears around being able to handle the different languages. Could be many different languages, like with trafficking victims, or just cultural barriers, but that would even include the culture, like the street encounter, or even LGBTQ population, right? So how are you gonna, the fear of how you're going to, all of that, getting your leadership buy-in. Prostitution, especially, is not something that a lot of, hey, let's go help people that are involved in prostitution. So sometimes it's really challenging to get the buy-in to actually be able to express why is it important to not just to be able to help people to work on the issues related to the sex industry, but then also to be able to help trauma and not coming to you like crying at your door because they need help, right? So these are not necessarily people that are saying, that are in a stereotypical sense. And so can you convince your board, can you convince your leadership that that these are just trauma symptoms, that we need to be able to see through this, that we need to be able to help. These are the people that need the most help, the ones that are potentially resisting the help. And then how do you work with the leadership to make services a little bit more amenable, right? Like changing protocols. Nobody likes to change protocols. Your user manual in place already. You have your system in place already. It's really challenging for people. But, the thing is you don't necessarily need to change a lot, if anything, so it really depends on making that assessment, having those conversations, sustainability piece of it. So we're going to start working with this population. Does that mean we're going to get a flood of people in now? Are we going to be able to handle that? Are we going to be able to sustain for that? What is this? Where is this going to go in a year or 2 years? I might have a really terrific specialist on board now, but are they going to burn out? Are they going to turn over? Are we going to be able to train our future staff to be able to do as good of a job? So these are all kind of fears that I think people and agencies and leaders and agencies have when thinking about tackling this issue specifically.
And absolutely. And I think too, when you're coming up against these things, I think people need to kind of step back and use what they know that works for other populations. Yes, this population is diverse and there's all sorts of other things that play into it. But for example, if you are if you're running a program and you have people who have a history of substance abuse and people who don't have a history of substance abuse, and one of the people that does not have that history starts using with somebody else that does have that history, that does not mean that they recruited them, right? Like that's not what that is. That's influence, because you have a ton of traumatized people under the same roof, and sometimes that becomes a coping skill for somebody else. And so if somebody meets if a client and they start working together, that does not mean that that's recruitment, right? And there has to be a really clear definition about what's the difference between recruitment and influence, because recruitment's going to have, aspects of power and abuse and all of these different things that feed into it, where somebody's gaining something from that individual. If two people start working together, that means that they are buddying up, or using a buddying system to kind of watch each other's back, and actually is a great safety measure for them. That's where they're still at their journey, right? And so I think making sure that those things are defined, because there's a lot of hysteria that happens within some programs where those things are like everything goes worst case scenario right off the bat. And it's not that it doesn't mean that that's what it is at that time, but that's why it's so important to constantly be sitting down, reviewing cases, and making recommendations. Like, what can we do better next? And if we made it, how do we fix that, right? And just being open and honest and authentic with yourselves and your staff on a regular basis, to being able to, because I'm the hand for, right? There's no like, here is how you handle every situation, because the second you have it figured out, something else is going to get thrown your way that like negates every single thing you just did to be able to. And so you have to be able to have good crisis response and be flexible and be able to make decisions and reflect back on what's worked in the past, but also be open to new things that might work differently with somebody else. And then, getting leadership buy-in is going to be a huge part of this, because, for example, like we were talking a few minutes ago, sometimes, especially for adults, somebody will say, well, we'll serve trafficking victims, but we won't serve prostitutes, right? Like that's something that I hear all the time. And then there's kind of this like witch hunt to find out, like, is this person a trafficking victim, or are they prostituted? And is there, like sometimes when you're working in a domestic violence arena, somebody will say, well, if they've been impacted by domestic violence, they can come see us. So maybe they are not in a violent relationship at this time, but they were impacted by a previous relationship. And so we'll provide them services, but then those same types of mentalities are not executed towards trafficking survivors. So they're like, oh, well, they're not in a trafficking situation right now. No, they are working, but they were trafficked when they were 14 and 15. And so their life has been impacted by that trafficking. And so it's really important to be able to have those defined aspects of programming before you start going much further into, really ramping up your services, before all of those kinds of things are solidified with your board of directors and your leadership, and then training, like just a ton of training for the staff is so important. And if you are struggling with services for other populations that you're serving, and you bring in a new, kind of a nuance of expertise, sometimes when things start to fall apart, it's because it falls back on trafficking survivors, right? Like, well, all this started happening when we started serving trafficking survivors, but that's not like when everything's not stable within the agency already, and bringing on, it just kind of shows everything that's already going wrong. So being able to have that those strategic plans and implementing service is really important.
Yeah. So why would you say it's really important to be able to integrate human trafficking working with all kinds of vulnerable populations?
Well, one of the main things is for me, as a survivor, one of the problems I've seen is that when I was being trafficked, I already felt very isolated and alone from everybody. And I feel like when you have services that are integrated, now if you have a trafficking program, that's one thing, right? But if you are in a program that is multiple types of vulnerable populations and you have like all these services for one group of people, and then you have your trafficking services over here, like it feels very isolating, right? Like it feels even more isolating than where like this is the classes for the trafficking victims, this is the classes for everybody else. So one, that's why I think it's important within integration of vulnerable populations to make sure that we're not like isolating people out by their labels, right? Like that we're seeing them as whole people. My trafficking experiences were not my only thing that I experienced, right? Like, and so being able to make sure that when we're working with people that we're not segregating them based on those experiences. And then also we already have all of these really amazing services out there that we've been working really hard in movements of domestic violence, sexual abuse, gender equality, all of those things that we've been doing for a very long time, where trafficking fits into all of that, right? Like trafficking is a form of domestic violence. It is sexual assault. It coincides with substance use and homelessness and runaway and homeless youth and the LGBTQ community. It's not a silo and doesn't just exist on its own. Like if you're working with a trafficking victim, you're working with somebody who is LGBTQ or homeless or has experienced sexual abuse, or it's not out on its own, and we have to stop treating it like it's this separate issue from else that we're already doing.
I mean, that's a little bit of a fear I think I've seen. You know, it's kind of like if we're going to work on this issue, then we have to have this whole program stuff. So I definitely think that this is really useful, especially in places where you don't necessarily have the volume of people identify victims of trafficking, maybe in more rural areas, or you're working in agencies that are already seeing these clients on board, you know, help them. And so I definitely agree that there's a place where even the integration, like you were saying, in the groups, in the services, directly mixing with other clients, I think there's definitely a place for that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there's also a place for specialized services.
Absolutely.
In a larger organization that works with a variety of traumas, right? Yeah. Because there is a stigma especially to prostitution, or there might be immigration issues, and so you know there is a place where you want to be able to put people together in that way. But overall, like in my opinion, if your staff is fully trained to be able to handle cases of human trafficking, then they are going to every population. That's I really think that
absolutely,
that is going to create the top of class, case manager, advocate, any kind of staff that you have, counselors, mentors. If they know how to work with trafficking victims, and they're going to know how to work with absolutely. And, knowing how to do this, it's one thing if you just have a list of services that you can provide, but are you providing it in a way that produces long-term successful outcomes for clients, for survivors of trafficking? So really having this training and this knowledge integrated is important to be able to guarantee that kind of success, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and also just purely from an agency, working with trafficking also allows for funding collaborations, publicity. We don't like to say it. It really gives you an opportunity as an agency to kind of diversify and broaden your knowledge and present yourself to the community as having more of an expertise.
Yeah. And I think collaboration is a big point in that too, especially when we're trying to provide services and meet the needs. And that's where flexibility and identification and getting to know the people that you're serving and finding out what works best for them, so that you can either refer or be able to create groups and connections, or whatever the case, whatever services you're being able to provide that actually meet the needs of the individual person, and not just assume that what works with one person is going to work with the next person, right? Like everybody has their own thoughts and ideas and feelings around that. And I think the best way for me, what I've seen is the best way to approach this issue is having an array of services and not a one size fits all approach. And in rural communities, what I've unfortunately seen is that a lot of funders are coming together and building huge facilities for trafficking specific kiddos and adults, and yet they haven't ever even had a domestic violence shelter or been able to have a family advocacy center yet. And those are key components that are missing for the community, and without those are leaving people even more vulnerable to being trafficked in the first place, because only one section of an issue is being...
All right, I think I lost you.
I just cut out for a second.
Are we still on? Are we still on?
We are.
I
don't know what
I was waiting for a while. So yeah, everything you said. Also, you kind of touched on this before too, that there's that intersection of issues. But a lot of times, even with trafficking, you might have months where the only thing that is presenting is childhood sexual abuse or something like that, before you even recognize it. There's just, the definition of what is trafficking and what is other forms of trauma isn't always very clear. So it just seems like it makes sense that we understand and have the capacity to really work with all those forms of trauma.
Yeah. And I think that's such a key part, right? Because healing is a journey, and people are at different parts of that journey when they're coming into contact with these different agencies at different times of their life. And I would say out of 15 years of my own healing journey, that maybe 2 to 3 months was really spent in therapy on the trafficking piece, right? The most of it was spent on everything that led up to the trafficking. That was in my trauma therapy, right? When I woke up in the morning, it's not like I just think, oh, I survived trafficking. I survived this whole crazy life, right? This whole crazy life that had all these moving parts and different pieces that were at different times. And my healing process has been layers and layers and layers. But for me, my healing process really began when I was able to be stabilized. I was able to have a roof over my head, food in my belly, and started receiving psychoeducation to understand I even had a trauma history to overcome. And so there are some foundational pieces that are really important, which I think providers come into that role where there's some stabilization. But you have to know, if somebody's living in a shelter, it's really hard in that time frame for them to feel 100% safe, because it always feels okay, what's next after this? Where am I going to be after I'm out of a shelter? So there's almost an immediate sense of urgency just from being in a program like that. So if you're working within shelter spaces, you have to know, if you have a 3-month or a 6-month program or something like that, there's not going to there has to be ongoing support and stabilization after that for those healing components to even start being able to be integrated. And it's a complex issue for everybody in their different time frames and the length of the trauma that they've experienced, and all of those kinds of things play into their individualized plans of support.
Yeah. So let's talk about what integration actually means. Like, okay, what does that act? Basic level integration means that all the staff is trained on screening, right? Mm-hmm. Identifying potential trafficking and then knowing where to refer them if they can't provide the service themselves, right?
Yeah. And having leadership on board, right? Like, that's the first piece. And, like, your agency has decided at this point to integrate services, which means, you know, being able to screen appropriately, knowing what your limitations and what your boundaries are going to be for those services, having significant training for everybody involved, and then also knowing your resources within the community. So if something comes up that you're not able to handle in-house, who are you referring to? That's such a big piece of knowing all of those connections, as many as you can beforehand, as you start serving this population.
Yeah, so I've seen in the work that I've done with my own program that I started, and then other agencies around the country, I've seen everything from that they just have their staff, their advocates, their caseworkers are trained on the issue, and each of them might be working with the regular client load, and then if traffic in their client load, then they would just distribute them normally as they would all the other clients, and just kind of, you know, integrate like seamlessly and have going on. I've also seen agencies that hire a specialist or designate a specialist. So if they don't have additional funding, maybe they choose one person who's particularly good at working with trafficking victims, who has been trained within like a more advanced level training. Person becomes the point of contact within the agency for trafficking. And I've even seen staff themselves, caseworkers or advocates, who wanted to be in that position, and they've proposed it to their leadership, to their director. So that's, you know, if somebody's webinar that actually is in that position, not necessarily leadership, but the staff position, these are things that you can even propose. They don't necessarily need more funding, additional funding. If you have the desire to be in that position and to be designated as that specialist and get that training, then you can always do that. And then other aides take it further and actually change protocols and design specialized services. So, and that's what I did when I went in. So we were a child advocacy center. I think we were the second child advocacy center in the country who had a specialized program that worked with trafficked children. So I took the already existing protocols, but in the places where I felt like it wasn't quite meeting the needs of the working with that were, then we switched things up. We created a little more flexibility, a little more of an ability to respond to crisis in all hours, not just 9 to 5 in our office. We created more flexibility around defining whether or not to open a case. So we were able to open a case, not just a law enforcement case for trafficking, as would be the case for a sexual abuse case. It would have to have an actual law enforcement case. But we were also taking at risk. We were taking right. Clients where people said that they were just running away a lot and they think that they might be, but they're not sure. And sometimes we had the case 6 months before we even knew, right, what you're talking about, you know, that issue. And, you know, so there were little things that I changed and created a different set of protocols. We also had to include specifics about what to do when somebody's on the run. We would keep cases open longer, even when they're on the run, and it would be a really challenging and burdensome to close a case, do all the paperwork, the staffings and everything, and then open the case 2 weeks later when they came back from the run and still needed our services. So we actually were given a little more leeway in the amount of time that they can be gone and been. We didn't have a limit on no-shows. So obviously these things, everybody has to tailor what they're, how they're going to integrate. But you could do it from anywhere from just that basic like training and having the whole staff be very trauma informed to actually outlining specifics about like a specialized program within an agency.
Yeah, and I think it's really, and I think that's a big part of what people need to identify kind of in the beginning, if they have capacity for that or if they have capacity for that identified trafficking specialist, which honestly, I've seen a lot of really great successes with that, because you have one champion that kind of takes on the initiative. They network and they're like, oh, I just saw this training for this person, and they bring people in, and they're there to kind of change beliefs and like help people like think through things critically, like, is this recruitment, is it, that kind of thing, where you have that one person that's super specialized and just has a really great understanding. I've seen that as such a successful way of getting stuff off the ground within organizations. And there's a few agencies that I've consulted that have had that, and I'm just always blown away by like how much they get accomplished in like a year, because they have this like champion that's like, I'm going to do it all, but they're passionate about it, and that's
Absolutely.
what motivates people.
Mm-hmm.
So mm-hmm. I think that's really, really important. Which brings us to, I think you've covered pretty much all of the foundational stuff with integration and identifying our capabilities and what are some of those, what are different agencies' capabilities, and then some of the fears that come up for everybody, and how we address those within agencies. And I wish that we could sit here and give you all of this information for hours and hours and hours today, because it's a lot to talk about. And everybody that's on the webinar, I hope that this has been a kind of a good overview of integration and some of the things that have came up for people and agencies, depending on what they're doing and what they're able to support in their community. And we have another webinar coming up in a few weeks that is more on different aspects of integration. And we also have a certification program that's actually a really great program for integration of services. And it's a certification program for 16 weeks where we go really deep into all of the topics that we talked about today, including, running and how to handle crisis situations and different things like that. And it would be a perfect program for like if you have somebody in your agency that wants to be that one go-to person, or you are looking to integrate some new hire training for individuals that work in a multitude of different services within our, the county, the state, the country, being able to really give people the tools that they need to be able to handle all of these situations that we brought up today, and be able to integrate services within their agency or their community.